The legacy of Leatherface movies. This franchise has been alive for more than 40 years with some of the most gruesome and gory scenes in the history of cinema. Texas Chainsaw Massacre paved the way for slasher films by introducing its audience and several other filmmakers to new horror tropes. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, directed by Tobe Hooper, is one of the most gruesome, groundbreaking horror films to have existed. After a 12-year wait, Tobe Hooper directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which was a true American black comedy. The next film in the franchise was released in 1990 and did fairly poorly at the box office as compared to the first two. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation was originally released in 1994 independently, but distribution was stopped because of the poor reception, and it was re-released in 1997. 2003 welcomed a reboot of the original 1994 film and was produced by Michael Bay, which did more than well, which led to him producing the 2006 film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning. Finally, we had Texas Chainsaw 3D in 2013 and Leatherface in 2017 before the release of the most recent film in 2022. In this video, we will explore the true story and origin of one of cinema's most legendary horror icons, Leatherface. But before we dive into our explanation, please subscribe to us. Your small click will support us to produce more videos for you. Let's begin, shall we? The real-life psychopathic monster who inspired the films. In 1974, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was one of the first films to have been marketed as a true story, which garnered more attention and increased the curiosity of its audience. While it is often debated whether or not this franchise is entirely based on a true story, it was inspired by a series of true events and serial killers that have existed at some point. The main character, Leatherface, was inspired by Edward Theodore Gain, who was more popularly known as Ed Gain, the Butcher of Plainfield or the Plainfield Ghoul. While he didn't use a chainsaw as Leatherface did, he did make skin masks and wore them. And these murders took place somewhere between 1954 and 1957 in Wisconsin. Furthermore, he created several other household items like ashtrays made out of skulls and chairs and tables made out of bones and human skin. Popular horror films like Psycho in 1960 and Silence of the Lambs in 1991 were also based on Ed Gain. Kim Henkel, the co-writer of the film, also spoke about Elmer Wayne Henley, who served as an inspiration for the films and belonged to Texas. While it is interesting to note the similarities and differences between Leatherface and these serial killers, it is safe to say that these films were inspired by real events and people. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2022. This American slasher film, directed by David Blue Garcia, and written by Chris Thomas Delvin, is the direct sequel to the 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the 9th installment of the overall franchise. The film follows the serial killer Leatherface, who has returned after almost 50 years of hiding, and his unfortunate victims are a group of young entrepreneurs, who find themselves in Harlow, unintentionally disrupting his isolated world. While this film had its fair share of gore to get the audience flinching, it doesn't even remotely compare to the original film. In this sequel, Leatherface is as brutal as he can get, but we are always introduced to Sally Hardesty, the sole survivor of the previous killings, who is curious to investigate the recent events. Sadly, by the end of the film, only one of the youngsters survives, as Leatherface concludes another one of his Texas Chainsaw Massacres. Leatherface's birth was his gravest misfortune. Despite being a minor character in Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, Sloan Murphy plays a huge part in the development of Leatherface as the bloody murderer that he became. Sloan was his biological mother, an overweight woman who was unaware of the pregnancy and had an untimely and tragic death while giving birth to him. What was worse than her tragic death, however, was what ensued after. Sloan had given birth to a deformed baby at work, and after her passing, the supervisor was repulsed by the baby and threw him away in the dumpster. This tragedy introduced us to Luda Mae Hewitt, who appeared in the 2003 remake and then the 2006 prequel. She was a scavenger, picking through a dumpster when she heard a baby crying, and decided to bring him back to the Hewitt residence, and named him Thomas. We are made aware of the bullying and ridicule that Thomas suffers because of his physical and mental deformities and disabilities, and Luda May is fiercely protective of him. In the prequel, it is revealed that the Hewitt family are cannibals, and Luda May's character is more deeply explored in the comics, with 13 appearances. Nonetheless, Sloan and Luda May both play an important role in who Leatherface truly was, and it makes one wonder if his birth was a tragedy. His appearance and troubled adolescence raised his inner demons. When you read about a serial killer or mass murderer, you always wonder why they did what they did, and in this case, why did Leatherface kill people and wear their faces as a mask? This is where the difference between Ed Gein and Leatherface comes to light. Ed Gein did it because he wanted to honor his dead mother, whereas Leatherface did it because he feared his mother. However, it wasn't as simple as it sounds. Thomas Hewitt went through a lot from the day he was born, from being abandoned to later being bullied for how he looked. He had seen it all. He was born disfigured, with a skin disease, which led to relentless bullying and mockery, and him being ashamed of how he looked. He also suffered from muteness and mental retardation, which didn't help his cause either. Growing up, he had no friends, and he was isolated for most of his adolescence. Even when Thomas got a job, his boss and co-worker bullied him for his appearance and retardation, which led to him killing his boss, and after which he procured the chainsaw. His fall from grace, further and further into the pit. It doesn't matter which storyline we follow throughout the franchise, with sequels, prequels, reboots, and 3D versions, it leads us to the same outcome: a troubled child with a tragic past, who becomes a notorious serial killer and mass murderer known as Leatherface. This character is one of the grisliest in the history of horror cinema, and what makes it even more interesting is the transformation of a child with deformities into a ruthless killer. Every film has Leatherface and a terrible background, the only difference is the cause. In the original Leatherface timeline, he was a mentally challenged boy who eventually committed crimes because of his family, and in the 2003 remake and 2006 prequel, the social abuse and years of being shunned by society for his looks and deformities turned him into a killing machine. No matter which plot you look at, and which angle you observe, just like every other serial killer in history, Leatherface wasn't born a ruthless killer, he was turned into one, sometimes by his own will, and sometimes otherwise. Why does he keep so many masks? According to Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel, the director and writer of the original film, the masks that Leatherface wore determined his personality. For example, when he is wearing the old lady mask in the 1974 film, he wants to be domestic. He wears his killing mask when he is chasing and murdering his victims. The idea behind these masks was so Leatherface could express himself using these personalities he derived from the masks because he couldn't do so on his own. However, the remake of the film offered a more concrete reason for his masks. The facial deformity that he suffered from ate away a large part of his nose, and he wore a leather mask to cover his face, hoping he wouldn't be subject to social abuse. Later in the film, he continued covering his face with a mask, only this time he used the skin of people that he killed, and while the masks don't hold much significance in this film, he continues changing them occasionally. Was he truly evil, or an unfortunate victim? Nobody is born evil. Circumstances, surrounding, and upbringing is what turn a person into something they didn't intend on being, and that is exactly the case with Leatherface, who was, for the lack of a better word, the best serial killer in the history of cinema. Like every other serial killer, fictional or otherwise, Leatherface wasn't born evil, and for the most part, his family played a huge role in what he became, and if it wasn't his family, he was a byproduct of social and societal abuse that he endured for as long as he was alive. Leatherface wasn't the definition of evil, he doesn't pick and choose innocent victims, he mostly kills people who are intruders, like in the most recent film, his victims were youngsters who disrupt his isolated world. Future of Leatherface. Even 40 years later, this franchise has managed to continue its legacy with the most recent Netflix film, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is a direct sequel of the original film. The director David Blue Garcia has some plans in his pocket, and so does Netflix if the franchise decides to continue, which is entirely possible given the cultural impact Leatherface films have had on cinema as a whole. More importantly, the film had a post-credit scene that shows Leatherface walking into his home from the original 1974 film, which leaves its fans hopeful for more gruesome and grisly films. At the moment, there are hopes for another film on Netflix by February 2023. That was all in this video. Do hang around for more awesome content on everything that's movies, comics, and TV.